Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to Maritime Matters. My name's Richard Dunley and I'm joined by my co-host Jennifer Park. We're recording on Friday the 26th of June 2026. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we unpack the developments that have been happening in maritime security and wider maritime affairs in the Indo-Pacific and more broadly. As ever, we have not necessarily been keeping up with our schedule, but we try and get this podcast out as regularly as we can do. Anyway, Jen, great to chat again. How are things?
Hey, Richard, great to chat. Look, I think that because maritime matters so much and there's been so much going on is why we actually don't get the podcast out.
I love the justification.
Yes, I'm not sure if it's a strong justification, but hey. Look, lots happening. Lucky enough to be at the ASPI Defence Conference this week, speaking about Australia's defence industry and how you create that strategic autonomy. And I was, degrees of strategic autonomy. And I was thinking and talking a little bit about Richard Hill's book from the 1980s on medium power maritime strategy, which frames a lot of my thinking about our relationship within our alliance with the US. So looking at that, I had a piece in the Fin Review last week talking about everyone's favourite topic, Australia's nuclear power submarines, in response to a statement from the former Foreign Minister, Gareth Evans, who said that the only reason Australia is acquiring nuclear-powered submarines is to track China's ballistic missile submarines, which is most certainly not an accurate statement. So you can see my rebuttal there in the Fin Review. It was also in ASPI's The Strategist, who kindly published it, and also on my website. And I'll have a piece coming out on Monday, which will be in the conversation, talking about what is happening in the Middle East, and this idea about whether Iran could practically toll the Strait, which my quick summation is no. In prolonged peacetime, the only way Iran could coerce ships to paying a toll would be to continue to attack ships with drones and missiles, which would mean that you're not in peacetime. Making the point that it's very different to, for example, the Suez Canal. And I've seen a reference in media recently where they'd say, well, some of these canals, ships pay to go through. And you're like, yeah, it's a completely different concept. Well within a man-made, people-made, well within a sovereign country. And the Suez Canal, for example, is about 200 meters wide. So easily to stop ships who try and run the gauntlet. The Strait of Hormuz, even at its narrowest point, is 39 kilometers wide. So it's a different ballgame. So that's the piece that I've got coming out. That's what I've been working on. What have you been up to, Richard?
My main activity has been the joy of marking, as ever. But I've also been trying to finally get out a report from a survey that we ran earlier this year, assessing Australian public attitudes towards the ADF. Surveys are very much in vogue at the moment, and sadly we didn't get ours out before the Lowy poll was out, which obviously is kind of the premier survey in this kind of broad area, but they focus much more on kind of foreign affairs and things, and we focus much more on specifically on the ADF. So that's been keeping me busy, and I'm sure I'll give it a spruik next time we meet. It's out by then.
Well, I look forward to reading it. I do look forward to reading it. It's interesting. It'll be interesting to see whether, where it's got similar areas, whether it is consistent with the Lowy poll or not. And speaking of the Lowy poll, there's some interesting things there. I mean, 62% of Australians identified that cyber attacks from other countries were considered the leading threat to Australia, which is actually quite consistent with this week. We saw the Director General of ASIO, Mike Burgess, give his annual threat assessment. And in it, he actually talked about a state actor who had infiltrated a network for some of our critical infrastructure. Now, he did not tell us any more than that, but the fact he's telling us that shows that cyber attacks are very much a concern. Some other key statistics I thought were interesting, and I'll get your take in a sec, but 73% of Australians consider the US alliance important to Australia's security. The support had slightly declined. I think it was about 76% in 25, 73%, but that's kind of in the margin. So that's still strong support, which is a significant contrast to 80% of Australians disapprove of the way President Trump has handled the military campaign against Iran. And certainly, negotiations via truth or tweet or whatever you call them is probably not the best. It's probably a lesson learnt from this conflict. Should have been known beforehand. But anyway, interestingly, 54% of Australians thought that China will be the world's most important and most powerful country in 10 years' time. 61% of Australians saw China as an economic partner more than a security threat, which is an increase from last year. But then that was kind of at odds with the next one, which said 62% of Australians believe China is likely or very likely to become a military threat to Australia in the next 20 years. So not sure how to read both of those. 50% of Australians supported increasing defence spending, so I would have thought that would have been a bit higher. And significantly, consistent with 2025, 68% of Australians support the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines. So I thought some interesting statistics. What were your kind of key takeaways from the Lowy poll?
Yeah, I think I find all of this sort of thing really interesting. I think one of the challenges for a lot of us who kind of work in this area and talk to other people who work in this area all the time is that we end up in something of an echo chamber, and we believe we kind of get this sense of what's important and what matters, and we have very clear opinions of it. And I think that within the commentariat there are, and kind of professionally more generally in Canberra, there are some pretty clear opinions, and they're not necessarily always reflected in wider perceptions. And I think the issue around security threats is precisely one of them. So obviously the Lowy poll identified cyber attacks as being the leading threat. We ran a similar kind of question, and terrorism was top of the list, followed by cyber attacks. So these kinds of perhaps less traditional, I guess, security concerns, or they're still traditional, but they're not kind of great power conflict type security concerns, are very much front of mind for many Australians in a way that perhaps they're not seen as being quite as front and centre within a lot of the area. And I also think it's quite interesting the degree to which, and the Lowy poll statistics, if you look longitudinally, are quite almost shocking about this, but the growth of perception of insecurity in Australia, and how few Australians now say they feel safe. And yet there's remarkably little support for or certainly change in support for additional defence funding. And again, that's something that we've looked at, and actually we've seen in many ways a decline in support for defence. So I think this notion of trying to kind of understand quite what's going on in terms of popular opinion and then sentiment, and I think a lot of it also comes down to questions of the fact that defence isn't front and centre of mind. So yes, there's a sense of insecurity, but that doesn't necessarily align with what we traditionally think of as defence. So I think there's some really interesting things to kind of unpack there. And I think there remains challenges around communication and the degree to which a lot of these messages are perhaps cutting through or not. So yeah, really interesting Lowy poll, and in some ways slightly depressing, but tis ever thus,
Yes.
right?
Yes, but well done to Lowy to getting it out. I'm glad you pointed the communication bit. Sometimes people interpret these polls as, well, if the majority of Australians don't support that, then that means it's not important, or we shouldn't do that. And I would interpret it as, if the majority of Australians don't support that or aren't, it's likely because they aren't aware of it. And I think that on the communications piece, and this has been a conversation for a number of years now. I think February 2024, I wrote a piece in the Fin Review about, defence should be involved in the defence debate. But I was kind of making the point that government and defence, I think, have a long way to go to really explaining to the public what is happening. And I was struck this week, for the last 6 years, we've had this annual threat assessment from ASIO. I mean, ASIO, one of the most secret organisations in this country, now does a public annual threat assessment. And so this week we saw Mike Burgess, the Director General of ASIO, give his threat assessment on Wednesday night. It was the same night as the US Embassy event in Canberra, by the way, so I don't know how many people paid too much attention to it immediately, but there was a great event at the US Embassy with fireworks, so that was distracting
and
from...
HIMARS on the lawn.
And a HIMARS. In fact, I will send you, Richard, a photo of me with the HIMARS, which I think you'll be excited to see, and my apple pie. But anyway, I think the annual threat assessment from DG ASIO is a really good way of informing the Australian public about what is happening. And then he does, he's done a series of media interviews with ABC, Sky, etc. Lots in that, not lots that's necessarily directly relevant to this podcast. A lot of discussions around espionage, an example of an official trying to be corralled on LinkedIn to sell AUKUS secrets. They didn't. But, I think that idea of how do you communicate, and somebody, I'm going to steal the idea, but it wasn't me who came up with it. Somebody recently wrote, wouldn't it be good for the Chief of Defence Force to give a similar threat assessment to DG ASIO, an external threat assessment? And I actually think that would be really positive. So, the communications bit, when you look at these polls, 50% of Australians, only 50% of Australians support defence spending. I wonder how much they think about the lack of sustainment funds to get the fleet to sea and aircraft to fly, etc. But I'm probably dribbling on a little bit, but I think that, when you read these statistics, it doesn't mean that these things aren't important. It often means that there's not a good job at communicating what the actual issues are.
Oh, absolutely. And that's one of the key themes that we pull out in our survey is thinking about actually, well, how much do the public know about the ADF? And the answer is surprisingly little. And that has improved slightly since last year, perceptions of knowledge of what's happening. But it's still remarkably low. And when you then ask questions about specifics, it's quite shocking how little the public kind of know. Again, it comes back to this sense of we talk about these things all of the time and we think they're hugely important, and in many ways they don't even register on most people's attention. So I think a lot more can be done in terms of all that. Anyway, we ought to actually talk about something to do with maritime, really.
We should. But it's also to do with maritime, right? The ocean is 70% of the world's surface. Anyway, that was a terrible segue. But what's happening with HMAS Sydney, Richard?
So we've talked a lot about the cycle of regional presence deployments by the Royal Australian Navy is continuing. So on the 9th of June, HMAS Sydney, Hobart-class destroyer, left Fleet Base East, and she's heading to Hawaii for RIMPAC, which is kind of the premier global naval exercise, but certainly the premier one in our part of the world. But that is part of a wider regional presence deployment in which she will then kind of engage in other exercises and training with partners and others around the region. And although there's no details, I suspect she'll end up in Northeast Asia and then come back through Southeast Asia, would be, or something along those kind of lines. Only days before she left, HMAS Toowoomba, who was on the last regional presence deployment, arrived back in Fleet Base West, HMAS Sterling. So, and as the defence media statement said, she'd completed 52,700 kilometres and had been to Indonesia, Philippines, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, and had been engaged in a number of activities, including Operation Argos, which is the sanctions enforcement against North Korea, exercises with Japan, as well as taking part in exercise Balakatan, which I think you talked about last time.
Yeah. I smiled when you said 52,700 kilometres. I have vague memories of being a junior officer and being asked to work out how far we travelled during a certain passage or something for a press release, and I may or may not have fudged some of those numbers. So maybe she travelled 50,700 kilometres, maybe she didn't. But either way...
a long way.
Yeah, she went a long way. Had a really really big trip. We talked about, so I say in an earlier podcast, we've only done 2 this year. So the other podcast, that she went through the Taiwan Strait. Interesting that she was undertaking Operation Argos and didn't have, or at least there was no publicly reported incident with the People's Liberation Army, Navy, or Air Force, which has been happening in the Yellow Sea with Australian assets consistently over the last couple of years. So that's interesting. But either way, busy deployment for Toowoomba. And I think, look, great to see, this has now been a couple of years now of just persistent presence through these regional presence deployments. I still do have a hankering for the task group deployments. I think that when you think about demonstration of capability, I like the idea of the bigger task group deployments, but of course the opportunity cost of that is you're not going to have the persistent presence. I'm actually writing a piece at the moment. I'm not sure I'm going to publish it because I'm not sure how long it will be, but talking about this idea of, if you think about the concept of Australia as a regional maritime power, and when we get the upgraded Megamis, when we're operating nuclear powered submarine, we're certainly entering that realm. Well, how does a regional maritime power exercise influence? And maybe it's just a hook for me to go back to, we need task group deployments.
I think it's a really interesting kind of question, and it comes back to some bigger things that I've been thinking about for a while, about this idea of, if we're talking about presence, what's the value of persistence over kind of size and impact, and particularly around some of the challenges in places like the South China Sea, where you have the Chinese are able to exercise real persistence. What's the value of being able to sail a warship 4 times a year through that bit of the area of sea versus being able to send a larger task force there once? What do these mean, and what kind of signals do they send? I think there's some really interesting kind of questions, and I'd love to know what degree of kind of deep thought there is into understanding those kind of communications and what kind of signals they send and how that changes. But I don't suspect we're going to get any particular details out on that one.
No, I don't. There may well be deep thought. There might also be fleet availability, which we won't get into because we will be here all day if we start the discussion about fleet availability. But speaking of task group things, RIMPAC. So RIMPAC has kicked off. It's always a good run ashore in Hawaii. RIMPAC's been going on for a very long time now. In fact, my notes tell me that RIMPAC actually began in October 1971, so longer than both of us have been alive. I reckon that would be worth a lot of money, by the way, the RIMPAC 1971 t-shirt. Everyone who goes to RIMPAC buys the RIMPAC t-shirt. So if you had a RIMPAC 1971 t-shirt, I reckon some people would. So if you're listening, if you got one, you should let us know how much. Yeah, we might need that in our lives. Anyway, what is happening with RIMPAC? So it's on from the 24th of June, so commenced this week, to the 31st of July. So a month. It's the 30th iteration of the exercise. 31 nations, 40 surface ships, 5 submarines, more than 140 aircraft, and more than 25,000 personnel. Oh, I fudged my numbers. Australia has participated in every RIMPAC since 1971. It didn't begin in 1971. Anyway, this year...
I think Australia might have been at first RIMPAC, but I would have to double check that.
Well, Richard, I'm just going to say I'm reading straight from your notes. I should have let you read your own notes. You would have been much better at it. But anyway, you might be right. Somebody who was at RIMPAC 1971, can you just tell us on YouTube when it began, if you've got a t-shirt, how much you'd sell it for, and if Australia was in the first RIMPAC. Anyway, from the ADF, the Australian Defence Force, there are 430 personnel that are participating, which is still fairly low in terms of numbers. Australia's RIMPAC participation used to be upwards of 1,000, 1,500, something like that, often because it was supported by, an LHD with an army contingent. So HMO Sydney's going, as we've mentioned. Interestingly, I thought this was fascinating. Australian Defence Vessel Guidance, which is the vessel we acquired a couple of years ago, civilian vessel for seabed warfare. So Guidance has gone across there, as well as the Royal Australian Air Force P-8 Poseidon and a Wedgetail aircraft. ADV Guidance. She's our seabed warfare platform. Now, exactly what that means, what is on her and how she's employed, of course, is not publicly available, which kind of makes sense. But one of the things I noted about her being over there is everybody's worst, well, I think anyway, the worst name for a naval exercise in the world is Exercise Maritime Big Play. It's a terrible name. It's been getting around since 2024. Now, But anyway, exercise Maritime big play, which is part of the AUKUS Pillar 2, work on uncrewed and autonomous capabilities. It seems to be taking part adjacent to or as part of RIMPAC, which is really what it looks like guidance is there to support. So I thought that was really interesting. Real focus there on seabed warfare. I had a piece in the Australian Defence Supplement recently talking about how it is interesting to see, we often critique gaps in capability, but Australia really is pivoting into the seabed warfare space, or it looks to be in the public domain, and that was backed up by Richard Miles' comments at Shangri-La in May. So that's RIMPAC. What's your thoughts on RIMPAC, ADV guidance, my terrible reading of your notes?
Yeah, I think it's interesting in terms of the association of maritime big play with RIMPAC and some other kind of interesting little snippets that you try and read the tea leaves of some of these press announcements and things. So the very brief section talking about maritime big play talks about the driving acceleration of interoperability of underwater acoustic communications.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Which is interesting because it is the fundamental challenge of particularly operating UUVs in these kind of spaces, is how to actually communicate with them. And anyone who can ultimately address that challenge is going to have a huge operational advantage, or address it in any kind of meaningful way. So I thought that was notable. Whether or not anything comes of it, who knows? And I'm a little bit more of a cynic on some of this seabed warfare stuff than I think you are. I think lots of it sounds wonderful, but when we start talking about, the French talk about seabed control in the same way as we talk about sea control, and it's like, well, yeah, you've got one asset that can get down below 2,000 meters, and 60% of the ocean's seafloor is below 2,000 meters. So what are you actually going to be controlling with it? But anyway, that's a different kind of rant. The other thing,
but an important one, and I agree with you completely.
The other thing which I thought is always interesting with an exercise like RIMPAC is just how big and diverse it is. So obviously 31 nations, you can't do the same kind of things with 31 different nations. And so they're doing things from amphibious operations, gunnery and missile exercises, ASW, air defense, but then also military medicine, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, counter-piracy, explosive ordnance, and diving and salvage. Like, how you try and put all of that together, I have no idea. I'm like, hats off to everyone who's involved. But I think it's just interesting seeing the huge diversity, not only of participants, but also of the types of activities in order to, in many ways, facilitate.
Yeah, I mean, genuinely, they do start planning RIMPAC straight after the RIMPAC, so it takes like 2 years to plan. But I agree. Look, I'm not sure that we are doing enough on seabed warfare, but I do think, coming from, my experiences as a junior officer, and I went to the UK and came back specialised as an anti-submarine warfare officer, having done the UK's course and operated 2087 and all these things, and got back to Australian Navy, and they're like, I know, we don't have space for those, so you're a surface warfare officer. And I was like, but isn't like undersea important? So I guess moving from that moment about 10 years ago or slightly older, showing my age, to now where, whatever you think of the actual effectiveness of the capability, the moving into Ghost Shark, moving into Spear Tooth, low frequency active towed arrays on the Hunters when we get them. And who knows actually what this was, but do you remember a couple of years ago, it was announced through the US that we'd acquired these kind of deployable strategic towed arrays that nobody's ever talked about since, but obviously they still exist, and I'm probably sure one of them goes on ADV guidance, I would suspect, right? So there's all of that. There's the ADV guidance thing. There's the, Deputy Prime Minister or Defence Minister talking about these things at Shangri-La. I think that, I'm not saying we've solved the problem, but I think we are certainly pivoting into that in a way that I've never seen before, certainly in my career in the Royal Australian Navy. So I think that's positive.
I absolutely agree with you. My only cynicism is more around the awareness of the scale of the challenge. And some of the comments and things recently about, we've got, we can use total side ray sonar image scanning images on the down to 2,000 meters and things, and it's like, great, you can do that once. Does that give you the ability to persistently monitor what's happening along a submarine cable? No, it doesn't. So I think that we're still groping to understand what protecting
groping is a terrible word.
Critical maritime infrastructure. I hadn't even thought about it. Jen, why? Why?
No. Everybody listening to this podcast is going to be thinking that's a terrible word. That wasn't just me. That's just not a word that you're not allowed to use that word anymore. It's banned.
Okay. Seeking to understand what protecting critical maritime infrastructure actually involves. But anyway, we ought to move on.
We better move on. What else is happening?
So P8, Operation Gateway, one of Defence's longest running kind of continuing operations. Operation Gateway has been running for 45 years. As part of this, 3 RAAF P8s were deployed to Butterworth in Malaysia, and they were completing kind of missions, so maritime patrol in the Northeast Indian Ocean and South China Sea. Reasonably regular Australian P8s operating from Butterworth in these kind of areas, and we've seen the relatively consistent harassment of these assets by particularly Chinese fighter jets over the past 2 years. But just another iteration of this. We generally hear about these things after the fact, unless something significant happens during the activity. But it's another part of when you start talking about Australia as a regional maritime power, and Malaysia has been one of our kind of longest standing and continues to be close partners. So I think definitely worth always flagging.
Yeah, absolutely right. Hey, I did just look something up while you were saying that, just so I didn't look silly. RIMPAC did start in October 1971, and Australia was an original participant. It was Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the UK, and the US. What a surprise! 5 Eyes exercise. But it has rapidly expanded. All right, like oh god, I can't remember the year that China went. Now, like China goes to every RIMPAC. The Chinese Navy goes to every RIMPAC, but there was
the invite.
Yeah, they just don't get the invite. But the period where the Chinese Navy was invited to RIMPAC, which I think was probably circa 2014 through 2017 or something, in that era. But look, we've covered RIMPAC and Gateway. The other one I did want to touch on, just because I think this is a really great operation, Operation Render Safe. Render Safe's been going since 2004. It has just finished, so Render Safe is about clearing unexploded ordnance from the Pacific. This year it mostly focused on clearing unexploded ordnance in Papua New Guinea. But the bit that I thought was interesting was that the press release says 2 Royal Australian Navy Huon-class mine hunters. I would have said the only 2, but it makes it sound like we've got more. Have also deployed, or will deploy, in July to Tuvalu as part of Render Safe to conduct technical reconnaissance. Who writes this stuff? Like, to look for unexploded ordnance in the, I'll pronounce it incorrectly, Nanumea Lagoon. So good to see our 2 mine warfare vessels. I am fully expecting that one of them would be decommissioning this year. I don't know that, but I would expect. So I wonder if this is the final trip for Yarra or Diamantina.
Absolutely. And coming back to our previous conversation about defence comms and technical reconnaissance.
Searching for bombs.
Yeah. Like, if you don't speak the language that people understand, then you can't really expect them to understand your messaging. But yes. Anyway, messaging that did come through, although I don't know quite what to make of it. Indo-PACOM back to PACOM.
Yeah.
What were your thoughts? I was a bit confused.
My thoughts weren't dramatic. I know there's been a lot of claims, and I mean, they might be right, I don't know, but that this is the US abandoning the Indo-Pacific construct. And look, I think it's clear to say that under the current administration, there has been probably a devaluing of the Quad. Although when President Trump was inaugurated, the Quad Prime Ministers were front and center in the inauguration. So everyone thought that was a really big symbol for the Quad. But kind of since then, we've seen, a deterioration of relationship between the US and India over tariffs and Russian oil and things like that. So it's taken a bit of a back seat. There has been some US documentation that has used the term Asia Pacific as opposed to Indo Pacific. So many read this as part of that lens. I'm not sure that I read it that way. I mean, we are seeing also this trend of the US Department of War or Department of Defense, depending on how you want to refer to it, but they call themselves the Department of War, going back to historic names. And of course, PACOM has a lot of history in this region. So I think that would have, it may not have been the primary determinant, but I think that would have been one of the factors. What's your take?
Yeah, I find the optics on it odd. Like, nothing is actually changing. PACOM's area of responsibility is exactly the same as what was previously Indo-PACOM.
Yeah.
So nothing is changing on the ground. So this is all about signaling a message. And yes, I take all of your points. I think there is a historic relevance to PACOM, and I think certainly there are some, particularly within kind of the old guard of bits of the US Navy and elsewhere, that were kind of flag bearers for the old idea of, well, this is a PACOM and we shouldn't have these kind of new constructs. But changing it to Indo-PACOM sent a signal. Changing it back again sends even kind of more of a signal. I have no idea, but I saw this be quite a lot of discussion around kind of the conversations that Trump had with Xi Jinping and all sorts of things, and whether or not there was anything in that, and I have no idea, and I'm not convinced by it particularly. But it does send some pretty odd kind of messages, and I don't really buy the idea that it sort of doesn't de-emphasize the Indo bit, but emphasizes the first island chain. If only, like, the Japanese are absolutely fully into the Indo-Pacific concept, as very much as Australia, right? It just sends some pretty odd kind of signals to me. I have no notion as to why it happened, but I thought it was an odd change.
Yeah, no, and look, all fair points. The one that some have made that I was skeptical of is the Trump Z meeting, and this is part of it. I mean, they held that meeting whilst there's a war raging in Europe, there's a war raging in the Middle East. There's been all of this tariff conversation. I'm just not sure the name of PACOM versus Indo-PACOM was top of their list to discuss. Through various interpreters, to be honest. But who knows? I wasn't there. Next time, if I'm invited, then I'll let you know.
Yeah.
Oh, I will. I'll tweet it out. Anyway, all right. So I guess moving on. A few other things happening in the region. A lot of activity from the People's Liberation Army Navy. There is a great Wall Street Journal piece talking about these operations, especially to the west of Taiwan. Neither of us subscribe to the Wall Street Journal because it's like $99 US a month. Like, really? But I'm sure it was a great piece. But there have been another, there was a Coast Guard activity. This was quite interesting about a month ago, I think, but I might get my details slightly wrong on that, where we saw Chinese Coast Guard vessels querying merchant shipping to the west of Taiwan, which didn't get a lot of airtime, but was quite interesting and quite a deviation from standard practice. There were some people like, this is the start of the quarantine, here we go, it's all kicking off. But I think they were the same people that were like 2027 because they were confused because like it's 2026. But either way, look, it is actually significant, and the level of activity has been significant. There has been reporting that the Liaoning carrier strike group, China's first carrier, their carrier strike group has been deployed for 40 days. So they've just returned to China. They conducted a 40-day deployment in the Philippine Sea and the South China Sea. And I think that, look, is 40 days long for a carrier deployment? No. But I think it is, again, a demonstration of how China is growing this power projection capability. So it did deploy as a carrier strike group with a number of ships. So it was with a cruiser, a destroyer, and a frigate. Interesting, also a fast combat support ship. It did an exercise in the West Philippine Sea with also an amphibious group. So it just shows how much that capability is growing. I mean, when was this commissioned? I think, what, 2012?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, how much their capability has grown in the last decade in terms of maritime power projection. And the other thing I note is, and this is not necessarily significant, but another Chinese naval task group has just arrived in Vladivostok for a visit to do an exercise with the Russian fleet. So we're seeing more and more of these deployments, as task groups, and even the carrier strike group. What's your take, Richard?
Yeah, no, I think that agree with everything you said. I think there's some interesting kind of developments around. There's been some reporting of a new class of replenishment ship, larger class replenishment ship, and I think we're beginning to see expansion of that, and that will provide further kind of blue water capability. And we talked about this on here and elsewhere. The Chinese Navy is already a large blue water navy. It's only getting bigger, and it's only going to grow in terms of its capability. And so it is going to be operating in the kind of well outside of the first island chain persistently for the very foreseeable future. And that capability is going to grow slowly. It does feel like they've kind of really had quite a measured approach to this. And I think you've seen this now with they had one carrier and they exercised that, and then recently they've been doing two joint carrier deployment exercises. I think there's been one where I think they deployed all three carriers. I can't remember now, but they're incrementally building their capability, and we're going to see more of it. So I don't think there's any particular surprise in that, but it is going to be a reality of our region.
I agree. I mean, for a long time, people were obsessed that China's strategy is an A2AD strategy around the first island chain. China's strategy is not an A2AD strategy around the first island chain. It's a layered strategy that involves global power projection. And that's what we're seeing their Navy grow into, and we're seeing the increasing deployments. Speaking of deployments, Surf West. We've got some news on Surf West.
Yep. So announcements coming out of the US around kind of some of the structural and kind of organizational elements around Surf West. So they established US Submarine 3, overseeing the operation of these submarines, which are rotating, because we have to use that word, through HMAS Sterling. And there's also the establishment of kind of one of the maintenance structures, which will be supporting the maintenance of US submarines as part of Surf West. And there's also been that kind of, I guess, the sort of the back end element. There's been discussion around this for quite a lot of time, but thinking about how we actually going to be supporting US personnel who are permanently located in Western Australia, and the families and others of people who are rotating through. So it's the practicalities and the boring stuff that doesn't necessarily get huge. I mean, it gets more attention than this kind of stuff most of the time because it's got an AUKUS tag on it, but it's certainly not the kind of stuff that gets Malcolm Turnbull out of bed in the morning or others. But it does just show that for all the questions, got both for and against and everything else with AUKUS, the kind of the boring mechanics are just continuing to rumble on. And as far as we can tell, everything is set for the arrival of US submarines in 2027. Whether or not there's any British submarines, I'm doubtful. But as far as we can tell, everything's set for the Americans to be turning up.
Yeah, no, I agree. Whilst we argue about Block 4 versus Block 6, and then everybody realizes that we were never getting Block 6, and all they had to do was read to know it was Block 7. Sorry, if you're not tracking, that's a reference to what feels like an eternity ago, but the change in Australia now getting 3 in-service Block 4 submarines in the 2030s from the US, as opposed to 2 in-service Block 4s and a off-the-production line Block 7, which took over the Australian news cycle for 7 days. which made me
Second-hand subs,
swear off wanting to
or they're
talk about.
Holdens. I'm not sure. I can't remember.
There was lots of terrible things written comparing them. Somebody the other day online, in response to my post, tried to compare them to Manura and Kanimbla, and I was like, oh, come on, like,
That is the most
come on.
Australian thing I've ever heard.
That's not quite. But I guess that was equally to the I think we talked about this on our last podcast, the piece that came out to talk about leasing Japanese submarines, and in it the author said, we have done this before, like we leased Jarvis Bay, which was a civilian fast cat that we painted grey and used as a ferry. Bit different to leasing a submarine from a country that has never ever exported submarines. Slightly different. But anyway, I guess we're on the Cape. Oh, I just want to pick up on one point, actually, the basing versus rotation. So I get and agree to a point with your skepticism on that, but I do actually think there is like so I think you're partially right on that point, but I do think there is a difference between, and this is not a defined difference, but I think there is a difference between basing and something else. Now, rotating might not be that something else either, but for me, when you think about US basing, really you think about US control of that facility. And certainly when I visited US bases around the world, like there are US guards. That is when I lived on a US base, that is a US facility, Macca's and all, controlled by the US. And I think that the argument that HMAS Sterling is not that, I think is a fair argument. That doesn't mean that it's not a permanent force and that rotating is true. But
I would argue that the difference here is between the word a US base and the fact that US submarines are based out of.
That's a fair point.
Now, my narrative here is that if you are building schools for American submariners' kids to go to school in Western Australia, you can't really argue they're rotating.
Yeah, it's a fair point.
Like, that would be my... whereas the Marines, they're here for 6 months, they don't bring their families. Yeah, you rotate through. If you bring your family, you base them. Would be my kind of rule of thumb type approach. But obviously we can't use those words, so we have to use other words.
We're free. But no, so I completely agree with you, but I do think, as you said, that is a difference between what many have claimed is that this is becoming a US base, which is a very different thing.
Yeah.
For anyone who's ever been on a US base overseas would know that pretty clearly.
It's not Ramstein in Western Australia. Right? We're talking very different kettle of fish.
Although I think everyone at Sterling would be happy if they did get a Macca's at Sterling. So, could be some positives. Anyway, I can't see the timer, but I think we've probably gone well over time. Should we touch on just a couple of interesting capability tidbits? Which one do you want to touch?
Talk about North Korean destroyers. Which
I did.
I'm going to hand this over to you. Go for your life.
I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the North Korean Navy.
Who does?
But South Korea. South Korea does. Not many people in Australia. Maybe we should more. But I guess what we have seen over the last couple of years is this push that North Korea is trying to transition their brown water, green water Navy into a blue water Navy. So the North Korean Navy is about 60,000 people strong, which I didn't realise it was that big. So 4 times the size of the Royal Australian Navy, or just under.
It is the ADF.
Yes, same size as if you don't count the reserves, yes. Yeah. Which we don't. Traditionally, we should. Reserves matter. Anyway, so they actually call themselves the Korean People's Army Navy, the KPAN. I looked that up because I saw something saying KPAN, which sounded like K-pop, and I'm like, what is that? So it is the Korean People's Army Navy, 60,000 people strong, about 780 vessels, but I think a lot of those are probably small vessels, right? So brown water, green water Navy, 70 midget submarines. And look, a bunch of other capabilities, but they are really pushing to transition into this blue water Navy. So what we saw this week was that North Korea commissioned its largest warship to date, which is a 5,000-ton destroyer, the incorrectly pronounced Cho-hyun. Sorry for that pronunciation, in a ceremony on Tuesday at Nampo. So it's the first in the class. It was built at the Nampo shipyard. It launched in April 25, and they've been doing trials since April 25. What its capabilities are, to be honest, I'm not super clear, but certainly the biggest capability they have built, and quite big. I mean, 1,500 tons bigger than our Anzac class frigates. Its sister ship is due to be commissioned shortly. Its sister ship became a little bit famous. So its sister ship is called the Kang.
Infamous, I think, would be a better description.
Infamous, yes, infamous. Its sister ship is called the Kang Con. CanCon was relaunched in June 25 because when it was originally launched in May 2025, it fell off the launch platform, and you can see it on its side, which is pretty funny. And then they threw like a blue tarp over it so no one could tell that it was a warship on its side, except it just looked like a warship on the side with a blue tarp on it. You can look at the photos. The third ship is scheduled to be completed in October 10. It looks like they're building 4 or 5 of this class. Also, when this was commissioned last week, this 5,000-ton destroyer, North Korea announced that it's also going to build a 10,000-ton cruiser. Their aim is to build 2 large surface ships annually, which pretty impressive if they achieve that. I'm not. I love the Hunter class frigate. I think it's going to be a great capability. I think it gets too much flack, but we're already building the Hunter and we don't expect it till 2034, and the government still will not make a decision to accelerate it, which I think they should. So 2 ships a year in North Korea versus, I guess, I think we got steel last year for Hunter, maybe? So, what?
24?
24? Okay, all right. So 10 years. 10 years for one in Australia, 2 a year in North Korea. And again, look, I'm not... I think that we could build more.
You might be comparing apples and oranges slightly.
I might be comparing apples and oranges.
I'm not always the greatest fan of the Hunter class, but to suggest that you're comparing
No, I'm not...
dubious, I think, at best, North Korean capability. I would suggest that this is a classic example of a navy as a leader's folly.
Fair point.
Whether or not the North Korean Navy has any meaningful capability, I think remains a moot point. And why North Korea would want to build a large blue water navy from a strategic perspective. I'm not a Korean strategic expert, but it does raise certain questions there as well.
Come and circumnavigate Australia because that's in vogue. No, look, I agree with you. No, I'm not comparing. I am not comparing the capability of the Hunter class frigate, which I actually think would be a great capability, to the North Korean destroyer. All I'm talking about is shipbuilding rates, and I guess it was a way for me to not very subtly put in there that I do not understand why we have not made the decision to expedite the Hunter class frigate. And, once we get the first one in 2034, I think the battle rhythm is still 1 every 2 years. And I suspect that battle rhythm is built around workforce continuity as opposed to when we actually need the frigate. So that was kind of my not so subtle comparison in terms of urgency and times for shipbuilding. I don't think that the North Korean Navy is about to be circumnavigating Australia anytime soon. Anything else on the North Korean Navy before we move on?
I think we can park that one.
All right, fair enough. We'll give you an update on it next podcast. All right, what else is happening in the capability sphere, Richard?
So there's the submarine acquisition. They've been exploring the submarines for a little while. Last year, it was reported that TKMS had come out of the German submarine manufacturer had kind of won out against Navantia, where the other seen as the main option. The German defense minister revealed earlier weeks ago the deal to be signed later in the European summer, so relatively soon. A deal of around $8 billion US. Originally, it was a 6 submarine program. There's been reports I've seen in terms of the Indian naval defense stuff online saying that it's now 9. Similar, there's been a little bit of confusion around what exactly the design is. So the reporting is that Type 214, which is the kind of TKMS export submarine capability, regular export boat. There's also been reporting that it's actually a modified type of the 212 CD class, which is the German and Dutch TKMS are building for Germany. So a little bit unclear about that. Certainly, the Indian Navy is pushing ahead with its acquisition of submarines, which again is interesting in some ways because obviously they're also continuing and very interested in nuclear propulsion. And for a long time, have operated or studies operated Russian SSNs. They're pushing ahead with German submarines.
I'm sure we'll see a paper soon saying Australia should be getting German submarines, and we'll go around the boy.
We've been there so many times.
we have been there so many times, which is why it becomes frustrating because it's like we'd end up with no subs if we continue debating what subs Australia should have. The answer will be none if that continues. Anyway,
we've wrapped it up for life. I think we're to let our listeners go and get on with their lives.
Well, thanks, Richard. I think what's the saying? It shows that maritime matters. Actually, no, I've got one more thing. I'll say. I haven't actually told you about this, Richard. I don't know if you saw it on my social media. Speaking of maritime matters, a politician gave an interview on Insiders recently, where he said that we should not bother defending sea trade. It's too hard, which I rebutted, of course, because it's quite an important thing for Australia. The idea that you would just not defend maritime trade and then you would suddenly be able to continue to keep the economy going and fighting, I think is a strategic fallacy that many like to live in, but it's not realistic. If you don't have the capability to defend your maritime trade, what is the answer? You're either capitulating or you're relying on an ally to do that for you. But I rebutted it. The good politician did not appreciate my rebuttal, and there was some back and forth in the Senate this week on Tuesday night. It actually made the Hansard, where Senator Raf Ciccone, who is a big fan of AUKUS, referred to that in the Hansard and quoted me and said, "Sea trade matters." So I just wanted to tell you about that, Richard, and now I've told all of our listeners as well.
Wow, there you go. That is true impact.
Well. It would have been impact if they said, and the Maritime Matters podcast talks about this, and you should look it up. But that's not in that's not in the Hansard. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Well, we can once again reaffirm then that it is official. It's written down in print, the Maritime Matters.
It does. Thanks, Richard.
Cheers.